You know, the point of this series is humanizing leaders so we don't get caught up in this silly idea that politicians, especially prime ministers, are infallible in any single way. Most people know next to nothing about the vast majority of our prime ministers. They've built these clean little caricatures in their head that all somehow end up at great men. No, most of them were just regular guys who were in the right place at the right time and got handed a job that literally no one else knew how to do, not even them. Except one, and even he needed a second term to start getting things right. May 1st, 2026, and boy, if people thought the reality behind John A. Macdonald's first term was delivered cynically, they're really going to struggle with the truth behind Alexander Mackenzie, number two on this list. John A. was lazy, famously lazy. You can't even deny it. He earned the nickname Old Tomorrow. Part of it was indecisiveness. Part of it was that he was terrified of doing anything that might make people not like him. The man was addicted to social approval, and it shows all over his early record. He did eventually shrug off a lot of that nincompoopery in his second term, which we'll get to because holy crap, that's where all the good stuff happens. His predecessor? Not even close. If John A. Macdonald was old tomorrow, Alexander Mackenzie was new yesterday. The man who had zero patience for frivolity and cared less what anyone thought of him. The no nonsense approach shot Mackenzie straight into the Prime Minister's job in 1873 while John A. was busy trying to vomit his way back to sobriety. I'm guessing he learned a few lessons about decisiveness during that period. Alexander Mackenzie was a straight laced, no nonsense, blue collar Scotsman who cut stones for a living. Historians are pretty certain he didn't even know what a lie sounded like. He was a devout Baptist, hated wasteful spending with a passion so strong he barely spent money on things that actually made sense. He sounds like a man I would have liked, to be honest. Probably a lot. But that doesn't mean he should be spared. Alexander Mackenzie might actually be one of the reasons the Prime Ministership of Canada eventually became reserved for lawyers and finance guys, because good intentions don't create results. He came to power promising to curtail the reckless spending and lackluster work ethic that had already run the newborn country into trouble. And damn it, he tried. We saw this same voter dynamic actually recently when Pierre Poilievre almost single handedly took out Justin Trudeau by proving he was too unserious for the office. Unfortunately for the Conservatives, the Liberals must have seen these videos early because instead of running Trudeau again, which, let's be honest, Trudeau wouldn't have stood a chance, the Liberals replaced Trudeau with Mark Carney, who basically won on the sole merit of not being Justin Trudeau. I've argued and will keep arguing that Per Polyev didn't lose because of lack of charisma. It was it was more about how much charisma he had. People didn't trust him because he spoke better than Justin Trudeau, and everyone knows how that went. In fact, if that election was about charisma at all, Mark Carney would have gotten crushed. Now, just being honest, Alexander Mackenzie was not a technocrat like Carney, nor was he financially literate. But back in 1873, people still tied policy to honesty instead of charisma, so voters saw Mackenzie as the anti-bribery option they desperately needed. Unlike modern politics, parties didn't need to replace their leaders every time they lost. They'd run the same guy over and over because, let's be real, the internet didn't exist and most people were too busy trying not to die to pay that much attention to politics. Mackenzie rose to fame by helping to build the Kingston Penitentiary, which probably explains his psychotic level resistance to corruption. He hated bribery and double dealing so much that he took on the role of his own Minister of Public Works. As far as he was concerned, the only person capable of spending the country's money honestly was Alexander Mackenzie, and micromanagement wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. He had a very blue collar approach to economics. If you work hard and don't steal, everything will be just fine. Unfortunately, that mindset doesn't work so well when you're a stonemason LARPing as a financial manager during the Long Depression. Alexander didn't cause the depression, but he had no clue how to deal with it. And because he trusted almost no one, he had no one worth listening to for advice. Mackenzie saw the Pacific Railway as a madcap enterprise. He inherited a project whose budget had already spiraled out of control, so he was left trying to get costs back on track. I mean, so to speak. His big cost cutting idea was to build rail lines between rivers, then instead of expensive bridges, just build ferry docks, transfer the load onto the boat, cross the river, load it onto the next train segment, and repeat, sometimes even switching to wagon trails. Modernly, this seemed like a decent idea. You don't need to build new arteries when you add a neighborhood to a city. But this wasn't a city, this was the Canadian wilderness. On paper, it saved money on construction. In reality, it cost exponentially more in time, hassle, and efficiency, especially when the rivers froze in the winter and the ferries couldn't move. And don't get me started on the disconnected network. Every short segment needed its own depots, staff, stations, and trains. Imagine being a farmer where you're loading grain and livestock onto a train only to unload and reload the whole damn thing every time you hit a river. I mean, there go your savings. Alexander was a stonemason, not a transport tycoon. He thought in terms of minimal spending, not financial pragmatism. Even when he saw the problems, he couldn't admit he was wrong. That would be unscotsmanlike. So instead of going back to the original plan, he stopped the project entirely unless someone would do it at the price he was willing to pay. He set the entry fee so low no serious contractor would even bid. Then, true to form, he's decided, fine, I'll do it myself. He turned the public works into his own giant construction company, using civil servants who were suddenly expected to become railway builders overnight. Kind of like training civil servants to be drone operators or, soldiers. I mean, the Alexander Mackenzie style to military from 2026. And it went about as well as you'd expect. Contrary to Mackenzie's life philosophy, virtue is no substitute for skill and experience. He believed that if a man could put in an honest work on a ledger, he could do the same swinging of a hammer on a railway. There's a big difference between a paper pusher and a hammer swinger. The track they did lay was often so bad it had to be ripped up and redone almost immediately. Crews sat idle for weeks waiting for the Prime Minister to personally sign off on blasting powder because he couldn't trust a single soul not to steal. By the time he realized it wasn't working, the public works budget was so deep in the red he couldn't hide it anymore. His big money saving initiative became one of the most expensive mistakes in Canada's young life. Now, imagine being a cold, hungry, broke Canadian looking at this honest, hardworking man who looked just like you and thinking, oh, I miss the drunk. The voters figured it out. Mackenzie, despite his best intentions and honorable spirit, was a fish out of water, too stubborn to learn, too hardworking to quit, and too frugal to understand when he was broke. So in 1878, they politely told him to get lost in a massive landslide and brought John A. Macdonald back. Mackenzie did finish the Mackenzie did finish the Intercolonial Railway, a much smaller project with a much smaller budget, but unfortunately, nobody cared about that. A lot of people blamed him for nearly ending the Confederate dream because British Columbia had been promised a railway from one side of the country for the other and nearly left because of the railway mess, but I'm not sure. John A. had his procrastination and a bribe that would have been completely legal today drop him out of office. Mackenzie simply did what you'd expect a stonemason to do work really hard, expect everyone else to work really hard, and believe that the more he did himself, the less things would cost. And when that turned out not to be true, he had no idea what to do next. It's debatable whether anyone could have done much better given the depression and the mess he inherited from Macdonald's first term. But people will always come up with alternatives, after the fact. I think it's actually a very reasonable end to one of the most honest mistakes in the history of Canada made by one of the most honest men to ever hold the office. Doesn't mean he did a good job. It just means he did the job you'd expect him to do.